Joining us today to talk about the subject of the U.S. alliance structure in East Asia and related issues are three experts on East Asia. Starting off will be Masataka Okano, political minister at the Embassy of Japan. He's in charge of managing the U.S.-Japan alliance and monitoring U.S. foreign policy and U.S. domestic politics. Previously, he served as the director for foreign policy coordination at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with responsibilities including the planning and coordinating of Japan's foreign policy strategies. Next up will be Mira Rapp-Hooper. Sorry about that. Mira is a senior fellow at the Asia-Pacific Security Program at CNAS. She is formerly a fellow with the CSIS Asia program and was director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative there. Her expertise includes Asia security issues, deterrence, nuclear strategy and policy, and alliance politics. She was previously a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. And batting last is David Shear, formerly with the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He performed the duties of Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, in which position he dealt with all matters pertaining to the development and execution of U.S. national defense policy and strategy. Before that, he was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. And before that, he served in several positions as a U.S. diplomat, including ambassador to Vietnam. But most importantly, David once succeeded me as the political military section chief at the university, at the embassy in Japan.
There was nothing left for me to do.
So, Minister Okano, if you could start us off, please.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today. And Mark just told me that today it's be on the record. And I thought about Mira, who is very good at always speaking eloquently in the public setting. And I thought about Dave's smiley face, and I'm out of the government right now. I feel more relaxed to talk about freely in front of the audience, and I'm boxed in now. And I'm not so good as like Sean Spicer, who speaks clearly about government position. So what I'm going to say is not necessarily reflective of government position. And also, Mark told me that I should not give you a boring presentation like a Japanese perspective, foreign challenges like that. By the way, I'm very good at it. So I have to do some different things. I want to try to give you some different perspective about alliances so that it can be used as food for thought for the discussion in this intellectual community in Washington, D.C. So my message today is threefold. For the U.S., the alliance network has been an effective tool for national security policy, but will continue to be so even under this new administration. And second one is that the U.S. and its allies do not have the luxury of disputing with each other on burden sharing. And third one is that we should not be complacent about the alliance structure, but we should continue our efforts to make our alliance more effective. So for the United States, for me, an alliance is a cooperation of the countries which share not only common strategic interests, but also fundamental values such as freedom, democracy, respect for fundamental human rights, and rule of law. And I would also add that affinity shared by the peoples to other partners is also an essential element of this alliance. And allies work with each other so that their values, lifestyle, thinking will prevail in the world. And American policy has been more or less, of course, depending on the administrations, value-oriented comparing to other countries. And the Trump administration policy is America first policy. So national interests is articulated. National interest comes first. But we do not know yet to which extent value plays a role in its diplomacy. The administration puts a premium on making a deal whereby interests are more important than values. Then will alliance lose its significance in U.S. foreign policy? I don't think so. The alliance structure will bring enormous benefits to the U.S. because it can move forward its domestic, diplomatic agenda more efficiently and effectively by cooperating with the allies. You can make better deals with other countries by closely cooperating with your allies. And this is true in the particular context of today's political situation in the world. I said the particular context of today's particular situation. What does that mean? First, the situation in the Asia-Pacific is changing. The center of gravity of world politics and economy has shifted from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The change in the balance of power within the region makes this region one of the most dynamic, but the potentially most dangerous region in the world. North Korea is accelerating its nuclear missiles program. The unpredictable nature of the leader is concerning. If you look at the NHK news, like a BBC Japanese, 7 o'clock news, 9 o'clock news, always North Korea, followed by Mr. Trump. And there's no almost domestic political news inside. And that's very funny. China is increasing its military capability and economic presence. And the U.S. remains the world's largest power. And its relative influence is changing. And Russia shows interest in Asia-Pacific, using its energy resources like oil and natural gas, and revamping its military power. We see a number of sorties of our air defense forces jet going to monitor Russian aircraft coming to the Japanese vicinity recently. So the region is not immune from malign activities of non-state actors either, E2. So many countries in Asia-Pacific, including Japan, have been victims of terrorist activities. But these are known facts, and this is a very boring presentation so far I've made today. But I'll add another thing. So in the nutshell, the region is full of challenges. The U.S., Japan, and other alliances partners have many things on their plate. So we cannot cope with them alone. And if you disengage from this region, from this process, you will surely be marginalized in this region. But what I want to particularly stress today is another element that makes alliances more needed today. Foreign policy, that is, foreign policy has become a more challenging business for governments. And this is particularly true in open democracy countries like Japan, US, Australia, South Korea, in contrast to those authoritarian regimes. Because of globalization, and especially the expansion of cyberspace, people have access to events all over the world, and they can watch visual images of what's happening at different places in the world instantly. Sitting in front of a computer screen, you can almost think that you're in charge of the situation happening in a distant country, in echoing what the CNN anchor says or Fox News anchor says. And people's attention span has become very short. Confirmation bias does not allow leave no stone unturned type of discussion. So people have become more emotional, impatient, eager to jump to conclusions. And they are ready to express dissatisfaction if government policy is not in the right direction of their thinking. Not only should government leaders deal with foreign countries, but government leaders also should deal with the domestic front. That is even more difficult than the foreign front. So globalization and cyberspaces are not only the reasons why the government's room for maneuver has narrowed. Budget constraints, citizens' participation in the decision-making process, requirement for transparency, people's demand to government have become high, and more politicians show interest in foreign policy. By the way, for example, Golden Week, we have a long spell of holidays at the beginning of May, and many parliamentarians from Japan, since the Diet session is in recess, tend to come to the United States. And this year, about more than 25 parliamentarians came to the United States. And they do not come here for sightseeing at all. they do a serious discussions with Congress people here and administration people. They are very, very interested in foreign policy, and that's very encouraging. But these constraints do not exist in authoritarian, less democratic countries. The government can make decisions on their own quickly and effectively, and sometimes they do not need to show their cards in their hands. So they are in a more advantageous position. And we democratic countries have less advantage than authoritarian regimes. So foreign policy or conducting a foreign policy with strong support of voters is a big challenge. So this is a risk, and there's always a risk of introverted drive neglecting foreign policy. So that is why I think U.S. and its allies do not have the luxury of dispute burden sharing among them. So we should work together more effectively, enhancing respective competitive edges, and we are obliged to allocate more energy to get full support from your domestic audience to your foreign policy. In that process, you should be able to explain to your parliamentarians or congressmen or even the citizens, we should achieve this policy goal, this and that goal, and otherwise our interest will be damaged. And our resources are limited, but we can achieve this goal in close collaboration with our allies. That is the way we have to present things. If we fail to get the backing of the people, our foreign policy will become weak. Then we will be overwhelmed by a flow of events in the regions that may lead to a creeping change of the status quo and end up losing our standing in the region. We should not be complacent about the alliance structure. We should continue our efforts to make our alliances more effective. And what we should do to make our alliances more effective. First, expanding the roles and capabilities of the alliance. That is ABC, most important thing. Strengthening the defense architecture in each country is of primordial importance. And keeping up your economic strength. Our government has been keen on this issue, economic first always, and overcome deflation and also women's empowerment. And second, improving the security environment. It would be good if your neighbors, countries, are like yours, but you cannot change the regime of other countries, of course, and you cannot even change the nature of other countries. But you can create a situation that will urge those countries to become like us. So if your neighbors become more stability-oriented, seek similar lifestyles, and become more interested in their own daily livings, rather than nationalistic slogans, that would be good, I think. So in this context, I believe that rule of law is crucial. Observe the same rule and people respect each other. In Asia, we are still behind in this respect. Japan is the only country which accepted the ICJ, International Court of Justice, compulsory jurisdiction. By the way, today, 70 countries in the world have accepted. United States not. Other P5 countries not, except UK. And South Korea, China, Russia, our neighboring countries, do not have accepted these compulsory jurisdictions. So this is about, first element is rule of law. And second element is a people-to-people exchange. Direct contact and people experience with other countries are far more effective than any foreign policy propaganda. So I would like to share very promising figures. Number of foreign visitors to Japan in 2016. It was 24 million. And Chinese people, there was about 6 million Chinese people came to Japan last year. It corresponds to 0.4% of the total population of China. And ROK, 5 million, it corresponds to 10%. Taiwan, 4 million, it corresponds to 17.7% of the Taiwan population. And Hong Kong people, 1.8 million, it corresponds to a quarter of the Hong Kong population. And United States, 1.2 million, that corresponds to 0.4%. Isn't it significant? I think it's a very, very good figure. And third thing to make alliance more effective is building a network of alliances like a trilateral cooperation. And since I'm running out of time, so I don't want to expand on this at this stage, I will take questions if you're interested in this. And lastly, we should make sure that public opinion is not drifting toward a domestic first type of atmosphere. Counter-reaction to globalization is so strong in this part of the world. No country is immune from this risk. And Japan had a similar experience. ODA, Official Development Aid, has been very unpopular in Japan. We used to be the largest donor in the world, but it started to decline in 1998 and has started to increase in 2016 actually, but it's very difficult to sell ODA to constituency. Why are you spending so much money overseas? But, and so we should present the merits of the alliance to the voters. And in case of Japan, I'm rather optimistic on that front, since the current government is very strong. And also, the Japanese people have gone through difficult security challenges, and they have also experienced the change of ruling parties. And we can say that almost all political parties, except for Japanese Communist Party, have been in the government, so they know how to conduct foreign policy is. So bipartisan consensus has been gradually forged in Japan. So maintaining an alliance is easy to say, but it is actually a difficult job. So like garden, we have to tend to it every day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Okano. You raised several points that I'd like to follow up on in the Q&A if others don't. But before we get to that, I think we'll go on to Mira, who I think will be expanding on this idea of building a network of alliances. So, Mira, over to you.
Indeed. Mark, thank you so much, and thanks for hosting us here. It's a terrific opportunity to appear on a panel with these very distinguished public servants and stewards of alliances in Minister Okano and Ambassador Scheer. So as Mark suggested, I'm going to pick up on this idea that Mr. Okano just mentioned, and that is the idea of networked security in Asia. I'm going to revive a term that was really particularly popular about a year ago, headed into the last Shangri-La dialogue, when the Obama administration was making a big push behind the idea of networked security in Asia. Network security in Asia is basically the idea that the existing U.S. alliance system, that is the hub and spoke system of bilateral formal treaties in East Asia, can and should be supplemented by multilateral partnerships that have a role to play in supplementing the role of U.S. traditional defense treaties in the region. I'm going to argue that despite the fact that we haven't heard quite as much about this term under the Trump administration, there are good both theoretical and empirical reasons why network security in Asia is absolutely paramount. And I'm actually going to argue that under the Trump administration is more needed than ever. Finally, I'm going to conclude by noting that regional states need to start identifying both the configurations and the mission sets to which they would like to put network security if it is to succeed, and make some suggestions about how they can think about doing that going forward. So why did the Obama administration make this push for network security in East Asia? It's very easy to sort of think about the idea of supplementing U.S. alliances as simply a way to get partners to take on more of a burden-sharing role in the region. But actually, stepping back, the theoretical, in terms of IR theory, and empirical case for why 21st century Asia warranted a new take on alliances is a very strong one. The United States, of course, formed its bilateral system of hub and spokes alliances in Asia directly following World War II. Basically, all of its alliances were formed between the years 1950 and 1954. And at the time, most U.S. alliance partners in Asia had been completely decimated by World War II. So the alliance treaties that the United States extended were both an effort to provide blanket security guarantees to its partners, but also an effort to give those countries the protection that they would need to allow their economies to rebuild, to allow them to defend themselves by focusing on their domestic rehabilitation. And as a result, the United States had really great success with its alliance structures in East Asia. Not only has no U.S. partner ever been the victim of a direct attack, but countries, of course, including Japan and South Korea, have become beacons of democracy in the region, in addition to increasingly becoming capable in their own right in the military and defense sphere. And now are not only just U.S. treaty allies, but are really strong partners in the region. These alliances, of course, survived the Cold War itself. That is, they outlived the initial adversary they were intended to be against, and they were modestly repurposed in the 1990s to face the post-Cold War period of U.S. unipolarity. Now in the 21st century, however, U.S. alliances in both Europe and Asia are coming under some stress as we have seen geopolitics return to the global stage in the form of a revanchist Russia and a rising China. The United States is not actually in any kind of rapid structural absolute decline, but it is in relative decline with respect to China in East Asia. That is, the United States continues to grow at a modest rate, but China's economy and its military is growing faster. So the United States faces incrementally mounting challenges in the region in supporting its defense commitments and its commitments there more broadly. But in spite of this challenge, it also has some significant assets on its side, and that is namely the fact that since the early 1950s, when it formed its alliances, its partners in Asia are far more capable with respect to their patron than they were at the beginning of the Cold War. That is to say that the United States' key allies in Asia are certainly no longer fledgling democracies needing near unilateral protection, but rather regional leaders in their own right, at least middle powers on the global stage, and countries that have substantial capabilities of their own to bring to bear in the region. So this is sort of the structural and regional reason why we saw this push for networked security. That is this idea that America's partners in East Asia are increasingly able to lead on their own and able to really serve as an asset and a force multiplier in this increasingly challenging environment where China is powerful, is in many respects, and in particular in the maritime domain, asserting a more aggressive foreign policy. The United States faces challenges, but also has these force multiplying effects on its side. We now see in the Trump administration, I would argue, one of the greatest challenges to America's alliance system, arguably, that has occurred since the system was founded in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Trump, of course, on the campaign trail was quite hostile to the idea of America's alliances, both in Europe and in Asia. Since the president took office, he has certainly revised his position somewhat, and I think Ambassador Scheer will comment on this in his remarks today. He's certainly made clear that America's alliances will endure in their institutional form. That is, he's reaffirmed the importance of our security guarantees to Japan, to South Korea, and some of the most fundamental high-end commitments that America has in the region. But nonetheless, the administration's foreign policy in Asia remains highly unpredictable. At the very early days of this administration, we saw an inclination to perhaps escalate with China over Taiwan and potentially take a much more hawkish tack towards the region. Since early February, we've seen an inclination to actually have a much more warm and potentially accommodationist policy towards China, at least for the purposes of dealing with the nuclear situation on the Korean Peninsula. So it's very hard to predict exactly what direction the Trump administration's policy on Asia is going to take. And that naturally raises some concerns for allies as far as what the United States standing in the region is going to be months or even years hence. Additionally, I think it poses challenges to alliance partners in East Asia that the administration is far from filled out in terms of its senior political appointees working on East Asia. So while it is very important that our security guarantees have been reaffirmed, it is very difficult for this administration to maintain them on the working level without having assistant secretaries, without having deputy assistant secretaries in place who can constantly tend to those partnerships, as Minister Okano referred to as being absolutely crucial. So why would networked alliances matter in this environment? I think that in the Trump era, networked alliances in East Asia have two merits that maybe did not seem so significant before. The first is that by supplementing its bilateral alliance system with multilateral partnerships, states in Asia actually can gain some leverage on the United States. Bilateral alliances naturally give the advantage to the stronger power when it comes to any type of negotiation. Basically, in any type of bilateral arrangement, the United States, in its role as a security guarantor, has a certain amount of leverage over its allies in East Asia. But compare that to NATO, where a multilateral alliance structure allows for something closer to consensus-based decision-making. Of course, the United States is not going to completely rework its alliances in East Asia to make its security guarantees themselves multilateral. But by supplementing its existing alliances with multilateral arrangements, partners can work together to try to make their case to the United States on the issues that they care about, and encourage Washington to course correct if they are concerned that perhaps it is taking its gaze off of fundamental issues in the region, such as Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, where we've seen relatively less attention in the early months of this administration. Additionally, by engaging in multilateralization, engaging in security networking, partners can potentially compensate if the United States becomes distracted or takes its gaze off fundamental issues. An example would be that if the United States, for example, places less emphasis on security assistance to partners in Southeast Asia, to partner capacity building initiatives, countries like Japan and like Australia can take the lead on providing that type of aid, which they already do to the region, and helping states to coordinate that aid amongst themselves. So again, multilateral partnerships have the ability to not only supplement but provide partners with a little bit more leverage in their engagements with the United States in the region. But in this environment of uncertainty, if allies and partners are to move towards more multilateral structures, it's necessary that we not just simply call for them to continue to network, that they do more than call for themselves to network, but to think about how that networking might occur. So it may be difficult to see this slide that I have up on the screen here, but I'll just describe it to give you a quick rundown. This 2x2 matrix is pulled from a report that some of my colleagues and I at CNAS are bringing out in the next couple of weeks, exactly on the subject of the next steps in networking security in East Asia. And what this slide intends to communicate is the fact that we can think of at least 4 different types of relationships in East Asia when we talk about network security and alliance partnerships. We can think about formal alliances, that is the U.S. formal treaty guarantees in the region, and we can also think about less formal partnerships. And then we can think about bilateral relationships and multilateral relationships, which gives us 4 different types of relationships that we might consider. Of course, within the cells that you see on your left, you've got formal alliances that include the bilateral hub and spoke system in the lower left corner, and multilateral alliances in Asia, which include the ASEAN alliance. But in this right-hand side, we've got multilateral and bilateral partnerships. And this is where most of the action is taking place when we think about what it means to network security. So in peacetime, you've got the types of activities that might occur in these blue circles. In peacetime, we see versions of layered security cooperation taking place in East Asia, and that means agreements ranging from bilateral decisions to call relationships strategic partnerships, to partner capacity building initiatives. We might call all of these things layered security cooperation. Partnerships in the region that take either multilateral or bilateral form could also, in crisis or conflict, constitute coalitions of the willing. But there are some things that network security can't do. And that is why it is important that the Trump administration has, in fact, reaffirmed its security guarantees in Asia at the highest levels, because U.S. alliances are the place where we will continue to see activity concerning planning for formal defense cooperation, where we would expect to see missions relating to deterrence and defense. And fundamentally, these activities cannot be replaced by networked security partnerships. So the main point of this slide is simply to demonstrate that U.S. alliances continue to be the fundamental bedrock of alliance relationships in East Asia, but that if we start to think about where network security partnerships can be useful, I think we see a way forward in terms of roles and missions that alliance partners in the region themselves can take on. That is, that Japan and Australia in particular can start to increasingly act as leaders in the region, as they already have, to encourage further layered security cooperation in peacetime, and potentially even be leaders in coalitions of the willing if crises are to occur in the region. But that, in fact, this form of security cooperation will not supplant, but only supplement the very important hub and spoke system that will continue to be the bedrock of our alliance partnerships in Asia. So with that, I will hand it over to Ambassador Scheer, who I know has a lot to say on alliance partnerships, and I'm sure we'll touch on network security as well.
Mira, I've given Dave the hard task of following up, and he might have said a lot of what you were going to say, or he said, so he has to maybe change some of his presentation, but he's good at that, so Dave, please.
I want to suggest that the advent of the Trump administration resulted in a large, significant loss of confidence among our allies in their alliance relations with us. I want to argue that this was a major challenge facing the Trump administration when it came in. The Trump administration has done a moderately good job at restoring allied confidence with some exceptions. They have some big opportunities coming up with various Southeast Asia leader visits to Washington this spring and summer, with the Shangri-La Dialogue, which Secretary of Defense Mattis will attend, and the APEC and EAS summits, which the President will attend. These events give the administration an opportunity not only to restore allied confidence, but to articulate a China policy and a regional policy that will better cement this administration's position on the region. Let me start with the problem of confidence. I think the campaign and the transition did instill a lack of confidence in our credibility, in our level of commitment to alliances, and in the continuity of our policy among our allies. I don't need to recite for you all of the things that candidate Trump said or all of the things that President-elect Trump said during the election campaign. Candidate Trump wasn't the only person saying things that affected allied confidence. Certainly, Hillary Clinton, Secretary Clinton, when she decided not to support TPP, I think shook allied confidence in East Asia as well. So candidate Trump wasn't the only person saying what you might call disruptive things during the campaign. So the administration faced a formidable challenge in restoring allied confidence when it came in January. And we saw this during the transition. Representatives of our allies and friends would come to us and throw their arms up and say, what are we going to do in the Trump administration? What does this mean for us? Look what President-elect Trump just said about China and Taiwan, etc. So the allies, just after the election, had already begun to feel the bite of some of the things that had been said during the election. That said, I think the administration worked hard to restore allied confidence and to restore our credibility in the early days of the administration, with some exceptions. By the end of April, it was looking like we had restored some continuity in our declaratory policy toward the region. Secretary of State Tillerson and Secretary of Defense Mattis had good visits to Northeast Asia. They said all of the right things. Vice President Pence in Australia and in Indonesia also said all of the right things. Made up for the January telephone call between the very contentious January telephone call between the President and Australian Prime Minister Turnbull. Went to Indonesia, visited the ASEAN Secretariat, and announced that the President would participate in EAS and the APEC summit. That one thing I think, was the single most important thing the Vice President did while he was in Indonesia. All the region was waiting to hear what the President would do with regard to those summits. And I think Vice President Pence's visit went a long way towards restoring confidence in our commitment to the region and understanding that we would continue to pay attention to the region at the highest levels. The President's meeting with Prime Minister Turnbull in New York also went very well. So I think the administration worked hard to restore confidence in our alliances. There were some exceptions. I was on a plane to Australia at the end of April, ready to say that there was emerging continuity in our approach to our alliances in the region. I got off the plane and learned the President had decided to charge the ROK $1 billion for THAAD deployment. So, that said, I think overall the administration has done a good job at relatively good job at facing the challenges posed by the loss of confidence in our alliances. I think that our allies continue to worry, however, about the consistency of our policies. They may have been put at ease about their own bilateral relationship with us, as has Japan, as has Australia, but they continue to wonder what our China policy is. They worry that the President is overly transactional in his approach to China and has not yet articulated an overall China policy, overall set of goals or ways of pursuing those goals with China. At the same time, they have not yet seen the emergence of a regional American strategy in Asia. The administration has repealed the Rebalance, but has not yet replaced it. In order for us to restore full confidence of the region in our commitment to the region, we have to articulate a regional policy. We have to replace or rebrand the Rebalance. And that includes finding some better way of managing and describing publicly our economic policy towards the region, because the Chinese are running circles around us in regional economic policy, and we've jettisoned TPP. We've not replaced TPP with a credible region-wide economic policy either. And the conclusion of bilateral free trade agreements doesn't make the cut. So we're going to have to find a way back into TPP somehow. And our allies, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand in particular, appear to be helping us to do that. There are some important events coming up that provide the administration with big opportunities to set things straight. First is Vietnamese Prime Minister Phoc's visit to Washington next week. All the region will be watching what we say to Prime Minister Phoc and what we say publicly about our relationship with Vietnam, and of course what the Vietnamese side says publicly about its relationship with us. We're going to have to address publicly our approach to the South China Sea. We're going to have to address publicly our economic approach to Vietnam now that we have jettisoned the TPP. Vietnam was the TPP partner that stood the most to gain from participation in that free trade agreement, and we pulled the rug out from under our Vietnamese partners when we rejected TPP. The next big event, of course, is Secretary of Defense Mattis's participation in Shangri-La coming up. Then Secretary of Defense Carter used his two appearances at the Shangri-La dialogue to articulate a systematic, comprehensive approach to the region. Of course, he focused on defense, but that defense piece was integrated into a rebalance, into an approach to the region that was comprehensive. And you could see Secretary Carter's thinking on the rebalance evolve over the course of his two speeches at Shangri-La. In his second speech at Shangri-La, he focused very intensely on the need for allies and partners throughout the region to network, as Mira described. Following Shangri-La in August is the ASEAN Regional Forum. My understanding is that Secretary of State Tillerson has said he will go. The ASEAN Regional Forum throughout the Obama administration was a way for us to ensure that the American agenda was fully appreciated by the region, particularly on the South China Sea. And through Shangri-La, through the ASEAN Regional Forum, and through the APEC and EAS summits, the region will be watching what we say, not only about North Korea, but about Southeast Asia and about the South China Sea. So these should not be left off the American agenda for these important events. We can take advantage of these events by articulating a China policy, by putting that China policy in the context of an overall regional strategy. Secretary of Defense Mattis should preview this in his remarks at Shangri-La. The administration should roll out an Asia policy in a major policy speech by a Senate-confirmed senior official before the president travels to APEC and EAS. And the president needs to define all of our goals and interests in the region during his participation in these meetings in November, not just press our allies for assistance on North Korea. That's an important goal, but it is one of a number of important goals that need to be expressed through the course of these meetings. A couple of cautions in conclusion. First, an exclusive focus on North Korea does not constitute a regional strategy. We all know how serious the North Korean nuclear threat is, but it's not the only issue in Asia, as I mentioned earlier. I welcome yesterday's FANAP on Mischief Reef. It took a while for the administration to execute the FANAP, but it's important that we continue freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea to ensure that China and the region continue to understand that freedom of navigation is a fundamental interest of the United States. I think that, as Mira suggested, our bilateral alliances in the region aren't the only things that need strengthening. We worked hard in the Obama administration to encourage networking among the U.S. and its allies and partners, and among our allies and partners themselves. This work has to continue. I don't think that our bilateral alliances are sufficient to balance China anymore. We need networks of like-minded countries to help us do that. Then Secretary of Defense Carter and the Obama administration understood this. The Trump administration needs to follow through. Our allies need to take more responsibility for regional security, but they can only do so effectively within the context of a network set of defense relationships, some of which include the United States, some of which don't. Why don't I stop there?
Thanks very much, Dave. We're going to go, by the way, until 11:30 because we've got three presenters, experts, and we want to have time to discuss fully the issues. But if anybody needs to leave before that, we won't hold it against you. Let me start off the discussion by picking up on something Dave just said, that the Trump administration has abandoned the rebalance policy of the Obama administration, or the pivot to Asia. And I want to ask whether, first of all, is that really the case? I mean, certainly TPP is one obvious way in which there's been a major change, but saying that the bumper sticker no longer applies doesn't mean that the policy itself would not continue. I mean, balanced Asia meant putting preponderance of U.S. naval assets in the region, paying attention more to East Asia. And I wonder, And maybe I'll ask Minister Okano this from your perspective in Japan. Do you see such a change from the Obama to the Trump administration of really in real practice jettisoning this idea of rebalance to Asia?
Well, first, branding, the concept itself, the branding of the concept itself, rebalancing or pivot, I think that it was under the previous administrations. It's quite natural that this administration does not want to use that. But when it comes to the context or content of U.S. security policy towards East Asia, I don't see any impact yet. We are still in the early stage of the administration. We have to be patient. What will be the outcome of policy review for each countries or regions or issues? But for example, as far as Japan is concerned, we established a leaders level contact at early stages. Prime Minister came to New York and also visited Washington and Mar-a-Lago and had a frank talk with President Trump. And so also Secretary Mattis came to Japan. Secretary Tillerson also had a conversation, intense dialogue with Mr. Kishida and Japanese leaders. And so that in terms of communication, I think that as far as Japan is concerned, I think that we are, our relationship with the United States is like it was before. And we, as Ambassador Scheer mentioned, that it's very important for this team to show its presence, not only East Asia, but also Southeast Asian countries and Australia. And the following events that is scheduled is very, very significant. So we want to see how it will work out. And but actually, we don't have to pay too much attention to the branding of the policy itself.
Yeah, thanks very much for that answer. Any follow-up, Mira or Dave, on this?
I think Prime Minister Abe in particular has done a very good job at establishing a personal relationship with President Trump. And I think that has done a lot to maintain stability in U.S.-Japan relations. But we have a lot of other alliances that need work. And if the administration is going to rebrand the Rebalance, it needs to say how it's going to do that and what the content of its policy is. We're in a very intense diplomatic game in East Asia that is based on the rise of China. And in a diplomatic game, in that diplomatic game that we're playing, leverage is everything. Our allies and partners in the region, particularly in Southeast Asia, need to have the confidence that the U.S. is active and present in the region. They need to know what the U.S. policy is. So the sooner the administration can articulate that policy, whether it's Rebalance version 2 or something that's more strongly rebranded, they need to get that out soon. And they need to get the people in place at senior levels who are going to implement that policy.
Mira, please.
I'll just tack on to that and note that I fully agree that it's totally natural that the term rebalance would be replaced. It is, of course, not only associated with the Obama administration, it's associated very closely with Hillary Clinton. But I will also note that the rebalance was more than just a brand. It was indeed a strategic turn as described, and part of its content, the fundamental core of its content, was the fact that it was a whole of government approach to Asia, meaning there was a diplomatic component, an economic component, which has met its demise in TPP, and a military component. And the problem as I see it in not having had a new Asia strategy articulated yet in this administration is that we're missing both the economic component and the meat of the diplomatic component. And part of the reason we're missing the meat of the diplomatic component is because we don't have senior officials, senior political appointees working on Asia who can do that real groundwork in the region. But the problem is that ends up looking like a stool that's trying to stand on one leg, military presence in East Asia is really important. As Ambassador Scheer suggested, I very much myself was glad to see that there was a freedom of navigation operation conducted in the South China Sea yesterday. But even if the Trump administration succeeded in getting its 350-ship Navy, that would not be able to do all of the work that the United States needs to be able to do in East Asia. That would not convince allies and partners, in particular in Southeast Asia, that the United States was committed in the long haul to all aspects of its presence in the region. So part of the reason why we need to see a strategy articulated sooner rather than later is to convince treaty allies, but also partners, countries that may be on the fence and tilting towards China, that the United States does have new diplomatic and economic plans up its sleeve for how it intends to continue having a presence in East Asia.
Thanks very much. Please signal if you'd like to catch my attention. I'll give you the floor. Okay, back here. Gentleman standing. And just state your name and affiliation, please.
It's on Libo Liu, Voice of America. I think Minister just mentioned that the allies cannot afford to argue about the defense
Burden sharing.
Burden sharing, thank you so much. But the Trump administration released a defense budget on Tuesday. I think in the budget there is a mentioning of transforming or changing the foreign military assistance on grants to loan-based arrangement. I don't know if you think that's a good idea, and anybody else, I really appreciate it if you have an opinion as well. Thanks.
So the question is in the budget, a change on foreign military assistance to something different, longer range. Anybody want? Okay. Dave, you want to comment on this?
Well, I'm not familiar with exactly how we structure foreign military financing, but it's clear that Trump administration budget cuts affect our ability to influence the region, not only our allies and partners, but others as well. It is imperative that we maintain these tools of statesmanship, and I'm just afraid that in this administration's budget, they are giving short shrift to those kinds of diplomatic tools.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Mira?
Yeah, just a brief comment on that. I mentioned in my presentation that potentially security assistance is an area where we could see the administration lose some focus. I think the reasons for that are pretty clear. These are long-dated initiatives which are highly unglamorous. They involve one-way assistance to security partners, and the returns on them are somewhat uncertain. They involve, pouring money into partners over time and hoping that they will be able to build up their capacity to potentially push back against China or otherwise help provide for their own security needs. But these are fundamentally important initiatives. We might expect those in particular that are run through the State Department to take the biggest budget hits. But as I also suggested in my presentation, I think this is an area where regional partners really have the ability to step up and try to plug some of the holes that the United States might leave. Japan already gives non-lethal partner capacity building assistance to states in Southeast Asia. Australia has been doing quite a bit of this as well, and South Korea has done some too. So this is an area where I think, again, if our allies are able to act in concert, at the very least to deconflict the aid that they're giving, try to convince other states in the region to step up in their giving of partner capacity building assistance, there may be some hope of offsetting some of the losses or inconsistencies in what the United States might be able to provide.
Masataka, I'm not going to ask you as a representative of Japan to comment on the Trump administration budget, but the idea that American allies can help to supplement or substitute in some ways. You mentioned in your presentation that Japan's ODA has been reduced. I guess that's because the bulk of it went to China, which no longer needs it, and some in Japan must be wondering what China did with this assistance if China's attitudes toward Japan hasn't changed and gotten worse. Is Japan's ODA shifting away from China to in some ways supplement American assistance elsewhere in Asia?
Well, Mark, that's a valid point. There was a lot of discussion why we are giving so much money to China, because they are launching space satellites and they are very active in its economy. And there has been lots of intense discussion. That is part of the reason why we cut the ODA assistance abroad. But well, it's not all about China. We are increasing this because, or we decrease this because in relation to the stagnation economy in Japan, is it really necessary to continue to provide so much money outside the world? So there has been a solid discussion within Japan, and we come to a point that, that as it reflected in the national security policy adopted by Abe administration, that we will continue to be proactive in the contribution of international community, so that not only this is not about the economic tangible interest of Japan, but we should do something for the sake of humanity. And so that we started to increase our ODA outside the world. About the point of security assistance, I think that one of the most important issues, as Mira pointed out, is particularly assistance to Coast Guard capacity in Southeast Asian countries facing a maritime situation in South China Sea. So that we are discussing with Filipinos and Vietnamese and other countries, not only within the context of bilateral between Japan and those countries, United States, those countries, Australia and those countries, but we're also doing a trilateral coordination among Japan, Australia, and United States, so that we can focus more effectively using our respective competitive edge, so that these countries augment its Coast Guard capability. That is a more immediate need in view of the situation right there. So it's only natural that sometimes some countries have to reduce its budget for domestic reasons, and we have to cope with that situation by collaborating with among like-minded countries. That's where in this that comes back to my point that in this Trump administration's period, alliances and network of alliances are all the more important to allocate our limited resources more effectively to achieve our foreign policy tool.
Thank you so much and for summarizing so well the theme of this panel discussion. Gentleman in the third row here, actually there's two of them, so we'll go first and then second.
Okay, Richard.
I'll wait for the...
Oh, sorry, thank you. I'm Richard Cronin from the Stanton Center. I'd like to see if the panelists could provide a little more thought or information, ideas on this linked question of having a gap in terms of policy leadership, second-tier leadership within the relevant departments, but also the issue of a regional strategy and need for one. And it seems that right now the bar is very low in terms of who the second-rank officials are going to be, political officials, in part basically that if they actually know something, they've had some experience, whatever, and don't have black marks against themselves in terms of their past history or statements or whatever. That's about seems like the best we can ask for right now, or so far anyway. And so my question is, even if we fill out the team of leadership, and even if they're all good people and knowledgeable, experience, but how is this regional strategy going to emerge? I mean, in other words, what mechanism is going to lead to this strategy? What's the concept behind it? Where does that come from? And so it's easy enough to say we need more people in the strategy, but I don't see how this is going to happen without the right context and the leadership. And so that's my concern. I wonder if you could actually, and the other, just related, there's not much real discussion among the policy community, articles, et cetera, about what a strategy should actually be. There's a lot of complaining about Korea or arguing about what should do with Korea, maybe some other things, but I don't see. I'm looking for some articles or writing and speaking that really gets at the heart of what should we be doing. Thank you.
Mira, this might be a question for you, coming from a think tank which has thought about some of these issues. And the Trump administration has, in some other areas, taken ideas directly from think tanks. I think in their budget for the State Department, I didn't like it, but they took it directly from a think tank, I thought. But any comments on this?
Sure. Well, I think there are a couple of different questions wrapped up in the one that you just asked. In a perhaps more traditional administration, we would expect strategy, probably an Asia strategy, to perhaps be initiated by the National Security Council. If you're talking about a whole of government strategy for Asia, a new rebalance of sorts. Certainly, my think tank CNAS did some thinking before the election about what that strategy might look like, and we were thinking that it would be at the initiative of the NSC, but pulling in all of the agencies for an interagency Asia strategy. That is certainly a task that General McMaster could very much still undertake. But I think there's a question as to whether or not, if it was undertaken, if this is something that the administration wants to pursue right now. As Ambassador Scheer raised, it certainly looks like our policy in Asia thus far is Korea first, second, and third. The question of the North Korea nuclear situation is, of course, a really pressing security issue. But something also curious about the way that that Korea issue is being pursued is the fact that the main avenue for trying to get at the problem appears to be cooperation with China. And that in and of itself is not a strategy, even for Korea. As many people in this room will be familiar, we have, of course, been down the road of trying to tackle the problem of nuclear weapons and long-range missiles on the Korean Peninsula for 20 years. And for at least those 20 years, we have noted the fact that China is central to the problem, and that if only China would do more to put the screws on its ally, the economy of which it almost entirely supports, North Korea might be willing to come to the negotiating table and make some real concessions. But the United States is not going to convince China to supplement its national interests on the Korean Peninsula with Washington's own, and is highly unlikely to get China to completely overhaul its strategy for its relationship with Kim Jong-un. So this is all to say that the environment that we're in right now is one in which General McMaster might well be able to coordinate a very thorough and sensible Asia strategy. But the administration itself appears to be pursuing this Korea first via China approach to the region. And until it decides it wants to broaden the aperture and see both North Korea and China as key players, but hardly the whole shebang in the region, the strategy on paper itself is not going to be representative of the state of play. When it comes to what a strategy should include, certainly it should, I think, at its forefront have U.S. alliances as the biggest U.S. advantage, and the way the United States can try to offset, as Ambassador Scheer suggested, the increasing challenges that are coming from an assertive Chinese foreign policy. It has to have at its heart a very multifaceted approach to China, one that recognizes that China is increasingly assertive in domains like the maritime domain, that China is sort of a bit of an entrepreneur in the economic and development space in ways that the United States has to think seriously about, but not necessarily wholeheartedly oppose, and that China can also be a partner on big global issues like climate change. But that requires a very nuanced approach indeed towards China to understand that the United States may have to compete seriously and accept risk in some domains while cooperating and giving some space in other domains. And so those would be the essential components of a strategy if it did come down to paper.
Thanks very much, Mira. We'll go to the third row again.
Rob Wimberly from the Boone Group. My question is, given China's advancements in anti-satellite technology, their development of a next-gen fighter program, and their deployment of air defenses in the South China Sea, what should the U.S. and its allies and strategic partners do to enhance deterrence in the aerospace domain?
Who wants to tackle deterrence in aerospace? Dave, please.
it'll be a while before China achieves military technology superiority over the United States. I think we continue to enjoy an edge over the Chinese. I think that edge will remain for some years. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be working on it. And in the Obama administration, our efforts were manifested through the third offset strategy, in which we sought to devise the disruptive technologies, you might say, that would maintain our edge into the future for the next 20 or 30 years. I think that effort is likely to continue. But it needs to be knitted into a regional policy, a regional defense policy that is itself knitted into a comprehensive policy. In the Obama administration, our efforts on technology, we joined our efforts on technology with a strong push to ensure that our posture was right-sized and placed in the places it should be. We had a partner capacity building piece through the Maritime Security Initiative, which I think will continue, looks like it may continue. And we also focused very strongly on strengthening our alliances and partnerships. All of these work together in harmony most of the time. And I think, and many of these efforts will continue as individual pieces, but they need to be brought together and pursued in view of our goals with respect to China and the region.
Thanks very much, David. Fifth row, please.
Thank you. My name is Hiroyuki Nakashima from the Rebuild Japan Institute Foundation. My question is about the this month's Belt and Road Initiative Forum was held in Beijing. It's a very new initiative established by China, which is throughout the Eurasian continent. And it's a multilateral and maybe the open framework. So I want to know your comments about the Belt and Road Initiative's implication to the stability of Asian regions, and also the implication for the United States alliances with the Asian countries.
So, implication for U.S. alliances and security in the region. Maybe Minister, you'd like to offer a comment on this?
Yeah, so this is a big conference, international conference. It's hosted by President Xi Jinping, and it was a big event. And this is a big, I would say, geostrategical initiative taken by PRC. And there are lots of debates about this concept, since the concept itself is still in the early stages. And it will lead to what? We are watching very closely. I mean, every country has its own political agenda on the regional level, international levels. And every country has a right to do that. And the Japanese government sent a delegation represented by LDP Secretary General Nikai, and participated in that conference. And our focus is what will be achieved, what will be conducted during this initiative. If it is related to a development assistance initiative or infrastructure initiative, we believe that that kind of concrete project should be something to be open to other countries or conducive to sustainable development of the countries concerned. So we want to watch what will happen closely, project by project basis, and also overall concept basis.
I'll just add a few thoughts to that. I just got back from Beijing a day and a half ago, and the signs are still everywhere from the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's all that anybody can talk about, the conference that took place a week and a half ago. But as the minister suggested, there is so much that is yet to be determined about the initiative. Theoretically, these projects may take place in up to 66 countries. Which is like a third of the world. The dollar totals that have been tossed around about the projects that may be undertaken range from modest to totally astronomical. And it's worth just noting that in general, prior to the Belt and Road Initiative, China does not have a terribly strong record of actually delivering on the aid that it promises. It tends to deliver, I believe the figure is about 10 to 15% of the aid that it ultimately pledges. So it is, as Mr. Okano suggested, a worthwhile set of initiatives potentially if this is development and infrastructure assistance to countries that need it. If that is what it turns out to be, that in certain places may be perfectly complementary with U.S. interests. But it's also worth, certainly the United States and like-minded partners like Japan, continuing to push on the question of what exactly this aid is all about. And asking questions that encourage Beijing to adopt good governance practices when it does put these projects into place.
Dave, follow up, please.
The Belt and Road Initiative is and the conference in Beijing were certainly great PR. The extent to which the Chinese can systematically implement the Belt and Road Initiative, as Mira suggested, remains in question. That said, Peterson Institute economist David Dollar has estimated that the Chinese can sustain $300 billion per year in outward foreign direct investment for the foreseeable future. That's a huge sum of money. The Chinese will be investing a lot of this in countries around China's periphery. That investment will not only have economic consequences for the United States and the region, it will have strategic consequences. The Chinese are thinking geostrategically. We should be thinking geostrategically as well.
Thanks very much, Dave. I'd like to just follow up a little bit on this major point about what you raised, actually, Dave, in your initial presentation, that the bilateral alliance structure no longer is sufficient to deal with China's growing strength. But I'm just wondering how this would work as a practical matter in Northeast Asia, where America's two principal allies have never been able to get along so well in practice. And now with the new South Korean president who has raised some questions even about the solution to the comfort woman issue, whether there's ever going to be any there in terms of more of a multilateral alliance structure in Northeast Asia. You know, South Korea doesn't see China, at least it doesn't enunciate China as a threat. Its focus is all on North Korea. And even with regard to North Korea, the cooperation has been so low level to date. Is there any real prospect here for network security operating in Northeast Asia? I think I might pose this to all three panelists. Maybe Masataka, you're nodding your head, so you could start off.
Well, trilateral cooperation, Japan, ROK, and the United States, I think has been doing quite well. That was the initiative Deputy Secretary Blinken, and he proposed that we convene a meeting almost every 3 months somewhere at deputies level. And that was quite significant. At first, many people thought that, do we have to get together every 3 months and discuss in North Korea and even women's empowerment? I mean, that each country is in charge of Japan or North Korea. They are supposed to write a document about empowerment, what we can do among 3 countries. Well, there's kind of suspicion at first stage that existed, I can admit. But since then, we continue to talk, and we schedule the meeting, whatever, irrespective of the events that's happening in that region. We got used to getting together. And it has become part of our life. And we are used to talking with each among the 3 right now. And so we achieved also a GSOMIA between Japan and South Korea, intelligence gathering or in good progress, and also missile defense exercise was conducted in Hawaii among the three. So it's quite significant to have that kind of acquire that practice of talking anything among the three. So there's a change in government in South Korea, and we are looking forward to continuing this trilateral cooperation. Actually, trilateral cooperation by its nature is not effective because you have to talk among the three, and you have to coordinate dates for the meeting, and also the interests of are quite somehow different, sometimes different among the three, and you have to converge these interests. But there's a good effect to show that the level of cooperation among the two to the third party, so that third party come to us, and also try to overcome some legacy issues between the two countries. And Mark pointed out legacy issues between South Korea and Japan. And this should not, there's a consensus among Japan and between Japan and South Korea, I guess, that this legacy issue should not be impediment to the security cooperation among the three right now. So we want to continue to push on the gas of this trilateral cooperation, especially among ROK and Japan and the United States.
Okay, thanks for that positive assessment of the state of play. That's good. Mira, please.
I also agree that trilateral cooperation definitely has a future. It took several steps forward under the Obama administration, as the minister suggested, and unfortunately has taken a step or two back, maybe just one step back in the last few months. But for better or worse, I come from a political science background. I think about international relations oftentimes in terms of threats and the balance of power. And if there is anything that is likely to keep trilateral cooperation on track, is the fact that the threat from North Korea is not going anywhere. I think no matter how well this administration performs with respect to the North Korea question, there is very little chance that we're able to put the North Korean nuclear and missile problem in a box. And that is the source of the reason that South Korea and Japan have moved ahead so much in the last few years on their cooperation. So with the GSOMIA, the intelligence sharing agreement, that is a real achievement between those two countries. South Korea and Japan each now operate their or have U.S. missile defense presence on their soil. This is certainly not something that we're looking or that our allies are looking to integrate at this stage, but certainly sharing lessons learned, talking about the future of missile defense is another possible way forward on North Korea. But as long as North Korea remains a threat to Northeast Asia, which I'm afraid is something that is going to be true for a very long time, I think that trilateral cooperation has a future.
I agree completely. I think we've had tangible, concrete results from the trilateral process already, and in my view, there are three of them. One is trilateral cooperation puts a floor under how far ROK-Japan relations can go down in a downward situation. And the continued American expression of interest in improved trilateral cooperation registers with both the ROK and with Japan. And trilateral cooperation is an important means of regulating the relationships among all three of us, I think, as allies. Second, we coordinate trilaterally at very senior levels. It is common practice for us to have cabinet-level interactions trilaterally after North Korean nuclear tests and major missile tests, and I believe we've had trilateral phone calls since the Moon administration came in. So I think that's a very important piece of the trilateral effort. Finally, as both Mira and Okano-san mentioned, the conclusion of the GSOMIA was very important. And information sharing and cooperation on missile defense is, again, a tangible, practical result of improved trilateral cooperation. And I think it's not going to go away.
Well, good. I think we might end on that positive note about positive trilateral cooperation. We heard earlier about positive trilateral cooperation between Japan, the United States, and Australia with regard to helping countries in need of Coast Guard assistance. If now only all of the parties involved would get people in place and enunciate comprehensive regional strategies, we'd be even better shape. So please thank me for, please join me in thanking. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Mr. Okano, Dr. Rapp-Hooper, and